Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The United States Constitution, First Amendment. Hello again. I'm Politron, the godless analytical robot. You may or may not remember me from the video Rethinking the Abortion Debate, in which I laid out a secular case against abortion. I've returned once again to speak with you today about the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. The First Amendment concerns what is commonly referred to as our freedom of expression, encompassing our free exercise of religion, speech, publication, peaceable assembly, and petition. As with all 10 amendments that constitute the Bill of Rights, it is an explicit expression of the limitations of government's authority over the individual, rather than a bestowing of rights upon the people. Let us begin with free exercise of religion. It was the concern of many of the founders, particularly Thomas Jefferson, who in fact had no involvement in the drafting of the United States Constitution, that the new American government might, by establishment of a state-sponsored religion or church, not only coerce and persecute its own citizens but pervert religion itself for political purposes. The First Amendment was intended to unambiguously protect the right of the citizen to be secure from government harassment or abuse due to his faith, or lack of faith. Religious freedom is further protected in Article 6 of the Constitution, which states that, quote, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States," unquote. In other words, government cannot circumvent the First Amendment by packing the legislative, executive or judicial branch with religiously homogeneous officials that would amount to de facto rather than de jure religious establishment. While it is clear from the writings of the founders that the Constitution was intended to establish a separation of church and state, debate has nevertheless raged over the years as to what form that separation should take. Do religious displays on government premises, for instance, represent sponsorship of a particular faith? Do the words "In God We Trust" emblazoned on our currency do the same? There are many who adamantly argue that they do. It is important to understand, however, that the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment refers to the official establishment by act of Congress of a state-sponsored religion or church. Additionally, any sponsorship of religion by government that has a compulsory element by which you are forced to exercise a religion against your will represents a clear violation of the separation of church and state. The words "In God We Trust" do not compel atheists by law to attend church or Muslims to refer to Allah by the Christian nomenclature of God. Nativity scenes on government property likewise do not represent religious establishment, so long as petitioners of all religious or atheistic groups are permitted to have displays should they so choose. Regarding freedom of speech, over the centuries litigation and legal interpretation have settled with relative clarity most of the grey areas in the language of the amendment, though the definition continues to evolve. As is always the case, your inalienable rights exist insofar as they do not infringe upon the rights of others. For instance, from its inception this amendment was understood not to protect libel, slander, perjury, or copyright infringement. More recently, in the Supreme Court case of Brandenburg v. Ohio in 1969, the concept of imminent lawless action was established, by which free speech is not protected if it is likely to cause a violation of the law faster than a law officer can reasonably be summoned to the scene. Other recently established limitations exist, such as the Miller test, which is used to censor obscenity according to community standards. Beyond this, your freedom of speech is boundless. You are free to openly criticize or praise government, society, individuals, and institutions. You are even free to lie, so long as those lies do not constitute libel, slander, perjury, or incite imminent lawless action. Freedom of the press goes hand in hand with freedom of speech, in that citizens are at liberty to broadcast their free speech to as wide an audience as cares to listen, be it by print, internet, television, radio, or otherwise. We should all, of course, embrace freedom of speech and the press, as it represents the most potent weapon against tyranny in our republic. The power to inform and be informed remains the determinative factor of who truly governs in any society. With this power, however, comes the power to disinform. While insidious, this power remains constitutionally protected, within the aforementioned limits of course, as the people and not the government must remain the final arbiters of what is true and what is not. As President Jefferson said in his first inaugural address, if there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. Consequently, the answer to bias or untruth in the media is refutation through participation in public discourse rather than censorship of the offenders. Hence this video. Freedom of speech and the press fascinates me the most, primarily because even the founders who drafted the First Amendment disagreed upon the extent to which this right was constitutionally protected. In 1798, in the midst of the quasi-war with France, President John Adams and the Federalists in Congress enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts to protect the federal government from, as they put it, domestic enemies. The Sedition Act made, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious writing, unquote, against the government and its officials illegal. Numerous newspaper editors were jailed and fined for criticizing the president and his administration. Fortunately, the act expired in 1801, before it could be challenged in court. Jurists have widely agreed that any such challenge would have succeeded. Nevertheless, the debate over the enforcement of truth and accountability in the media astoundingly still rages today just as it did then. The focus of modern ire is talk radio and internet blogging. The Fairness Doctrine, which was an FCC policy from 1949 until 1985, compelled radio broadcasters to present opposing viewpoints to their own on their programs. There is talk on the part of many Democrats, including former President Bill Clinton, of reinstating this policy by act of Congress. While the Fairness Doctrine was upheld by the Supreme Court decision Red Lion Broadcasting Company versus FCC in 1969, it stands to reason that compelling speech on the part of private citizens or interests is just as unconstitutional as restraining or punishing speech. Especially with the diversity of modern media, opposing viewpoints are ever present and freely articulated should citizens choose to seek them. Moreover, placing the arbitration of what is true or not in the hands of government rather than the people is anathema to the intent of the United States Constitution and the spirit of our republic. Finally, freedom of peaceable assembly and petition are the second most potent weapons, apart from speech and the press, in the arsenal of the American citizenry. They permit citizens to demonstrate by show of numbers their support for an idea or communicate ideas freely and directly to large groups of their fellow citizens. Freedom of petition similarly allows the citizenry to demonstrate popular support for a grievance to government. Without the freedoms of peaceable assembly and petition, government may dismiss any opposition movement as fringe discontents who constitute a minority, just as tin-pot dictators continue to do all over the world today. Furthermore, just as with the freedoms of speech and press, assembly and petition permit opposition to government to organize rather than be fragmented, disparate and ultimately powerless. We should, as Americans, celebrate the First Amendment, just as we celebrate the Constitution as a whole, without reservation. Our Constitution protects the voice of all peaceful citizens, from those who say that dinosaurs lived side by side with humans, to those who argue that President Bush orchestrated the September 11th attacks. If you find yourself offended or angered by your fellow citizens' speech, then stand up and lay out a thoughtful and compelling case against it, rather than demanding the FCC fine them or revoke their broadcast license. We do not muzzle political opposition or dissent. We must insist upon the freedom to organize, assemble and demonstrate our strength to our government, just as we insist that these freedoms be accorded to our political opponents. This country is predicated on the free exchange of rational ideas. It will survive only so long as the people of the United States remain actively engaged in the national dialogue. Thank you once again for your kind attention. This transmission ends now.